My son called me 4 times on a Saturday night in November, and I didn't pick up any of them because I was asleep in a recliner with a ball game on and my phone face down on the arm. When I finally called him back at 11:40, he was sitting in the cab of his truck in the gravel overflow lot behind a boat repair shop on River Road, about 2 miles from where the party had been. He had a bag of crushed ice from a gas station pressed against his mouth. I could hear him working his jaw around, trying to make his words come out normal so I wouldn't hear anything in them. He said, "It's not a big deal, Dad. It's just family stuff." I asked him why he was sitting in a parking lot at 11:40 at night, if it was just family stuff. He didn't have an answer for that. And that silence, friends, that little bit of dead air on a phone line that was the sound of 4 years of things I had let slide, finally landing on me all at once. It was a big deal, and that was the last night of my life I ever agreed to call it something smaller than it was. Here is what happened, and I'll say it plain, because it took me too long to say it plain to myself. At his mother-in-law's 60th birthday party, in a private dining room with about 40 people in it, my son's father-in-law backhanded him across the mouth. Not a shove, not a finger in the chest. An open backhand with a class ring still on it. Hard enough that my son's lips split against his own teeth, and there was blood on the tablecloth by the bread plates. And my son's wife, the woman he stood up in front of a church for, looked at him holding his face and said, in front of everybody, "Don't make this about you. Not tonight." Nobody stood up. 40 people, and not one chair moved. I'll get to all of it. Before I do, if you're new here, do me a favor, and put your city in the comments. I mean it, I read them, and I like knowing where this is landing tonight, whether that's Ohio or Texas or somewhere across the water. And if you're the kind of parent who has ever sat at a table and swallowed something you should have spit out, stay with me, because this one's for you. Now, before I tell you about the man who hit my son, you need to understand my son, because it changes what the rest of this means. His name is Nathan. He's 30 years old. He's a cook, a real one, the kind with scar tissue on both forearms from oven racks and a permanent little burn on the inside of his right wrist, shaped like a comma. When Nathan was 24, his mother was dying. That's a different story, and I don't tell it much. What I'll tell you is that we had a hospice nurse named Yvette, who came to the house 4 days a week for the last 2 months. And Yvette had a husband deployed overseas and 3 kids at home, and she never once mentioned any of that to us. She just showed up and did the hardest job in the world with her whole heart in it. 2 years after my wife passed, I got a Christmas card from Yvette, and in it she wrote that she wanted to thank Nathan again for what he did, that she still thought about it. I had no idea what she was talking about. So I called her. Turns out that every Sunday for the last 5 weeks of my wife's life, and then for 11 weeks after the funeral, my son had been cooking for that woman's family. Full meals, portioned and dated and frozen flat in bags, driven across town on his 1 day off, left in a cooler on her carport so she wouldn't have to stop and be thanked. 16 weeks. Something like 200 meals. He never told me. He never told anybody. I found out from a Christmas card 2 years late. That's the young man who was sitting in a truck in a gravel lot with a bag of ice on his mouth, telling his father it was just family stuff. The man who hit him is named Whitfield Vance. Everybody in New Hanover County, North Carolina calls him Whit. He owns Vance Coastal Catering and a wedding venue on the Cape Fear River called the Tidewater Room. And for 19 years, if you got married anywhere near Wilmington and you had money, you got married there, or you wished you had. Whit Vance is 64. He wears a blazer to a crab boil. He is the single most charming man I have ever disliked. He'll remember your daughter's name from one conversation in 2011 and ask about her by that name in 2024, and you will walk away thinking, well, maybe I had him wrong. You did not have him wrong. Nathan married Whit's daughter Sloan 5 years ago. Sloan is 29, and she is the events director at the Tidewater Room, which is a real job that she is genuinely good at. Whit hired Nathan about a month after the honeymoon and put him in the kitchen as executive sous chef, and stood up at the reception with a champagne flute and told 200 people he was bringing a son into the family. What he actually did was hire cheap labor he could yell at with no consequences and call it love. Me, I'm 61. My name's Ray Bellamy. I run Bellamy Cold Storage out on the north end of town, walk-in freezer space, blast chilling, dry storage, and a licensed commissary kitchen that restaurants and food trucks and caterers rent by the month. My father opened it in 1968 with 2 compressors and a loan from a man who never wrote anything down. It is not a glamorous business. It smells like refrigerant and cardboard. It has fed this family for 58 years. My flaw, and I want to say it out loud because I've earned the right to be honest about it, is that for 4 years I let my grown son handle Whit Vance by himself, and I told myself that was respect. It wasn't respect. It was cowardice, with a nice coat on it. I sat at a Thanksgiving table in 2022 and listened to Whit Vance explain to a room full of people that Nathan had a lot to learn about hospitality, while my son stood in the doorway holding a platter he had gotten up at 4 in the morning to prepare. And I looked at my plate, and I asked somebody to pass the rolls. I have thought about that plate a lot since. That's the kind of thing that comes back at 3 in the morning when you're 61 and the house is quiet. All right, the party. It was a Saturday night, November the 8th, Renata Vance's 60th. They'd closed the private dining room at the Tidewater Room, 40-odd people, mostly family and the kind of family friends who own things. Nathan wasn't a guest. Let's be clear about that, because it matters. Nathan was in his whites in the kitchen until the entrees went out, and then Sloan asked him to come sit down. So he took off his apron and sat at the end of the table like a man who'd been let out of a room. Here is what set it off. The printed menu cards at every seat said the fish was black grouper. Whit had ordered black grouper. What came in on Thursday was Almaco jack, because the grouper season had closed and Whit's supplier had told him that on the phone and Whit hadn't listened. Nathan had caught it Thursday, cooked the jack beautifully, and had the sense not to say anything about it in front of the room. But one of the guests, an older gentleman who fishes, took one bite and said, cheerfully, "Whit, this isn't grouper," and 40 people looked at Whit Vance. Whit turned to the end of the table and said, "Nathan, explain to the table what happened to my fish." Now, my son could have thrown him under the bus right there. He had every right to. Instead, and I want you to hear this, Nathan said, "That's on me. Season closed and I made a call. The jack's better this time of year anyway. Y'all are eating the right fish." He ate it. He took the hit publicly to save the man's face. And Whit Vance said, "Don't ever make a call in my kitchen again." And Nathan, quietly, not loud enough for half the table, said, "Then answer your phone on Thursdays." That was it. That was the whole crime. Whit came down that table. He didn't shout. He walked, unhurried, past 6 chairs, and he backhanded my son across the mouth in front of his wife, his mother-in-law, and 40 people holding forks. There was a sound, and then there was nothing. Nathan's chair went back about 4 inches. He put his hand up to his face, and his fingers came away wet. And Sloan, sitting 2 seats down, did not stand up. She said, "Don't make this about you. Not tonight." Nathan told me later that the worst part wasn't the hit. The worst part was the quiet afterward. It wasn't a shocked quiet. It was a settled quiet, like 40 people had privately agreed a long time ago that this was how Whit was, and the only rude thing in the room was bleeding. He stood up. He said, "Happy birthday, Renata." He walked out through the kitchen, and he put his knife roll in his truck, and he drove 2 miles and stopped in a gravel lot because he couldn't remember which way his own house was. There's somebody else who was in that building, and she's going to matter more than anyone knew at the time. Her name is Delphine Okafor. Everybody calls her Del. She's 46. She's been executive chef at the Tidewater Room for 12 years, and she has run that kitchen completely, top to bottom, ordering to costing to hiring since about the 3rd year. Because Whit Vance stopped cooking somewhere around 2009 and never told anybody. Del wasn't at the party. Del was where Del always was, on the line, working. She saw Nathan come through the pass with blood on his chin. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't cluck over him. She put a clean side towel around a bag of ice, handed it to him, walked him to the back door, and said one thing. She said, "Come in Monday at 5, before he's up. There's something in the walk-in you need to see." And then she went back to the line, because there were 40 desserts to plate. When I finally got Nathan on the phone that night, he tried 3 separate times to make it smaller. It's family stuff. He'd been drinking. It's not worth blowing up a marriage over. And I said, Nathan, a man doesn't put his hand on my son and then get to decide what we call it. He went quiet. And then he said, okay. Just that. Okay. I've thought about that okay more than almost anything else in this story. I think he had been waiting 4 years for somebody in his life to say the obvious thing out loud, and it happened to be a 61-year-old man in a recliner who should have said it in 2022. Now I know some of you are already typing. I know exactly what you're typing, because I thought it myself on the drive over to his place that night. He should have laid him out. He should have put that man through the wall. So, let me tell you why he didn't, and then you can decide. When Whit came down that table, Nathan had been about to pick up his own knife, roll off the chair beside him. His hand was already on it. He told me 3 days later, standing in my kitchen, I had my hand on the roll, Dad, and I thought, if I stand up holding this, I'm going to prison, and he's going to be the victim, and Sloane's going to visit me twice. So he let go of it, and stood up empty-handed, and walked out. That is not a man with no spine. That is a man making the hardest decision available to him, in about half a second, with a mouth full of blood, in front of everyone he knows. I've known plenty of men who could throw a punch. I've known damn few who could set a knife down. And no, we did not just let it go either. Sunday morning I drove him to the Wilmington Police Department and he filed a report. Photographs of his mouth, 2 witness names from the kitchen staff, case number, the whole thing. I'll tell you honestly how that went, because I don't want anybody thinking the system rides in on a horse. Simple assault, first offense, 64-year-old man with no record and a lawyer who golfs with everybody. The DA offered a deferred prosecution anger management class, no contact, dismissed in 12 months if he behaved. Nathan took it, because dragging it out was going to cost him a year of his life, and it wasn't going to unsplit his lip. So no, friends, nobody went to prison over this. That's not how it works, and I won't pretend otherwise. But there is a report. It's dated. It has a number. Whitfield Vance signed a document acknowledging it existed. I have a copy of that document in a folder in my office, and I never once had to use it. I just liked knowing it was there. Now here's the part I did not tell my son that night, because I didn't want to hand him hope before I knew what I was going to do with it. Vance Coastal Catering does not have a kitchen. I want that to sit for a second, because almost nobody in that county knew it. The Tidewater room has a beautiful finishing kitchen plating, warming, a 6-burner for show. But you cannot legally produce food at volume for 400 people out of that room, and you never could. Whit's entire operation, the prep, the butchery, the stocks, the bulk cold storage, the blast chilling, all of it runs out of a leased commissary bay and 4,000 square feet of walk-in freezer at Bellamy Cold Storage. My building, my father's building. His health department commissary registration lists my street address on it. Has since 2006. My daddy leased that bay to Whit's father back when Whit's father ran a barbecue truck at a friendly rate on a handshake that later got typed up. When Whit took over, he took over the lease at essentially the same number, and my father never had the heart to move it. And after he passed, I let my operations manager, a woman named Priscilla Harden, who's been with me since 2011, renew it every 5 years on autopilot without me ever really looking at it. I had never once thought of that lease as leverage. It was just a line on a spreadsheet that came around every 5 years like a birthday I forgot. It came due February the 28th, 11 weeks out, 6 weeks before wedding season. And here's the part that made my hands cold when Priscilla laid the file on my desk. Whit Vance had 63 weddings on the books between March and October. 63 couples, deposits down, dates locked. And there was not another licensed commissary in that county with 4,000 feet of freezer and an open bay. Not one. I checked, because I had to know what I was actually holding. I did nothing for 9 days. I'm not proud of that stretch. I told myself I was being deliberate. What I was actually doing was the same thing I'd done at that Thanksgiving table, waiting to see if it would somehow resolve itself so I wouldn't have to be the one. What ended the waiting was a text message. On Monday the 17th, Sloane texted my son, not Sunday, when it happened, 9 days later, and the text did not say, "I'm sorry." It did not say, "Are you okay?" It said, "Are you coming to Thanksgiving? Or do I need to tell Mom you're being like this?" Being like this. My son's lip was still split. He was eating soup, and his wife's only concern was the seating chart. That was the morning I stopped wondering how this was going to resolve and started deciding how it was going to end. Before I get to what I did, I have to tell you what Dell showed Nathan in that walk-in, because it's the reason the ending looks the way it does. He went in at 5 that Monday morning. Dell was already there, coffee going, prepping. She took him back to the big freezer, and she pulled out a milk crate from under the bottom shelf behind the stock buckets. It was full of recipe cards, hundreds of them, in plastic sleeves, handwritten, in Nathan's handwriting. Every dish that had made the Tidewater Room famous over the last 4 years, the smoked corn bisque, the brined pork with the sorghum, the crab that people drove from Raleigh for my son had developed them, written them out, costed them, and taught them to the line. Dell had been quietly archiving every card he wrote for 4 years, dated, in a crate, in the freezer. Because in September, a regional magazine had run a 6-page feature on the Tidewater Room, photographs of every one of those dishes, and the only name printed anywhere in that article was Whitfield Vance. Nathan told me he stood there holding a plastic sleeve with his own handwriting in it and couldn't feel his hands. And then Dell did the thing that I still can't tell without stopping for a second. She shut the freezer door from the inside, so the frame was facing them, and she pointed at the aluminum where nobody ever looks. There were names written on it, in grease pencil, dozens, 31 names, with dates beside them. Every cook, every dishwasher, every young kid with talent who had come through that kitchen in 19 years and been driven out, screamed at, stolen from, humiliated, let go the week before a raise. Dell had been writing them on that door frame since her 2nd year. She wrote Nathan's name on it, in front of him, number 32, dated, and she handed him the grease pencil and said, "You keep this. When you're out of here and you're standing somewhere that's yours, you come back and cross it off yourself. Nobody else gets to." Nathan put that pencil in his knife roll. He carried it for 4 months. So, what did I do? I called my attorney, a man named Gordon Beal, who has handled Bellamy contracts since the Clinton administration, and I asked him exactly one question. What happens on February 28th if I simply don't renew? Gordon looked at it for 2 days and called me back and said it was the cleanest thing he'd seen in a while. Fixed term, no automatic renewal clause, no penalty either direction, 60 days written notice as a courtesy, which we'd exceed. On March 1st, the tenant vacates the bay and the freezer, and the commissary registration attached to my address becomes their problem to solve somewhere else. No lawsuit, no stunt, no shouting. Just a piece of paper quietly reaching the end of itself. I want to be honest with you about the one thing that gave me pause, because I don't think revenge is worth much if you don't count the cost of it. 63 couples. I sat with that. Those people didn't do anything to my son. And I decided this. I was not going to blow the thing up in April with no warning. I was going to end it on the date it was already scheduled to end, with more notice than the law required, and Whit Vance would have 11 weeks, and every dollar he'd made in 19 years, to solve a problem that a competent man would have solved in 2. And then I made the second call, the one the title's about. I called Delphine Okafor, not through Nathan. I looked up the venue's line, asked for the kitchen, and asked for her by name. I told her who I was. I told her the lease was ending, and I asked her one question. If she had that bay, that freezer, and that commissary registration under her own name, would she run her own operation out of it? She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Mr. Bellamy, I've been running his business for 11 years and I've never once had my name on a menu." Yes, that was it. That was the whole plan. I wasn't out to destroy Whitfield Vance. I want to be precise, because people get this wrong. I never went near his customers. I never called a vendor. I never said one word to a single one of those 63 couples. I just stopped being the reason he had a floor to stand on. The notice went certified on December 1st. Gordon's office handled every word of it. It was 2 paragraphs long and there was nothing personal in it anywhere. It didn't mention my son, It didn't mention November 8th. It said the term expires February 28, and the premises shall be surrendered broom clean. It sat in Witt's corporate mailbox for 9 days before anybody opened it. Then the calls started. 3 on a Tuesday. Then 6 more before the weekend. By the following Thursday, my phone showed 22 missed calls from a number I'd never saved, plus 4 voicemails I did not listen to, plus a message passed through my front office by a very polite young woman who said, Mr. Vance would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. And then, an hour later, a Mr. Vance says it's urgent. And then, that afternoon, sir, he's in the parking lot. 41 calls, in the end. I counted them later, sitting in my truck, the way you'd count something you'd been handed. He had no idea, calling and calling like that I already knew exactly how every bit of this was going to go. I just hadn't decided yet whether I owed him a conversation. Somebody else got to me first. Sloane came to my office 2 days before Christmas. She'd never been there. Not once in 5 years of marriage. She had to ask the front desk which door was mine. She sat down across from me in a nice coat and she cried. And I want to be fair to her, those were real tears. She talked for about 11 minutes. She told me the venue was her whole life. She told me her mother wasn't sleeping. She told me her father had a bad heart, which I doubt, and that he'd made a mistake, and that he was a proud man, and that families work things out, and that I, of all people, should understand what it means to protect what your father built. 11 minutes. And when she stopped, I asked her one question. I asked her how Nathan's mouth was healing. She looked at me like I'd changed the subject. And I said, Sloane, honey, you've been sitting in that chair 11 minutes. You've asked me about your father's business 4 different ways. You have not asked me one single thing about your husband. You didn't ask when you walked in, and you haven't asked now that I've said his name out loud. She said, that's not fair. I said, no, it isn't. That's my point. She left. She didn't slam anything. I think that was the moment I understood that this marriage had ended in that dining room on November 8th, and everything after was just paperwork catching up to the truth. I gave Whit Vance his conversation on January the 9th, at 7 o'clock in the morning, on my loading dock. I did that on purpose. I never invited him inside. He showed up in a cashmere overcoat that cost more than my first truck, and he stood on a concrete dock in 38-degree wind off the river, while a forklift ran pallets past us, because I wanted him to understand exactly where he was standing. He tried 3 angles. I'll give them to you in order, because the order tells you everything about the man. First, he tried family. He said, Ray, we're family. You don't do this to family over a disagreement at a party. I said, you backhanded my son in front of 40 people, and your daughter told him not to make it about himself. That's not a disagreement, Whit. That's the reason. Then he tried making Nathan the problem. He said Nathan had been mouthy, that Nathan had embarrassed him in his own house, that I'd only heard one side, that kitchens are rough places and a man ought to be able to take a correction. I said, there's a case number. I've got the photographs. I've got 2 of your own cooks as witnesses. Do you want to keep going on this one? He did not want to keep going on that one. So then he tried money, which is what men like Whit always land on when the first 2 don't take. He said he'd triple the rent. He said he'd sign 10 years. He said, and this is the line I'll remember until I die. He said, you're going to throw away 19 years of on-time payments over one bad night. And I said, Whit, you've had 19 years of on-time payments because it never once occurred to you to ask why your rent never went up. You thought that was the market. That was my father liking your father. You've been standing on somebody's kindness your whole career and calling it your own 2 feet. He got quiet then, really quiet. And I told him the rest, because he was going to find out anyway. I told him the bay and the freezer had already been released effective March 1st. I told him the new tenant was Delphine Okafor. And I told him my son was coming on as her partner, not an employee. A partner, with his name on the door and his name on the menu. I watched something go out of his face when I said Dell's name. Not anger, something worse, for him. It was the look of a man doing math for the first time in 19 years and coming up short. He was standing there realizing that the woman he'd been paying like a line cook was the entire reason anybody had ever driven from Raleigh for his crab. He turned to go. At the top of the steps he stopped and said, "She's my daughter, Ray. Sloan will never forgive you." And I said, "That's not yours to hand out on her behalf, Whit. And with respect, it's not mine to worry about." I meant that. I still do. But I'd be lying if I told you it didn't cost me something to say it. I want to tell you about my son one more time before the end, because a lot of people would say he never got his moment. He got it. It just didn't look like a fist fight. In February, Nathan was at a restaurant supply house on Castle Hayne Road picking up sheet pans, and Whit was there. Whit came across that showroom fast, talking before he got there, telling Nathan he could fix this, that Nathan could come back, that they'd put his name on things now, that this had all gotten out of hand. And my son, 30 years old, split lip healed into a little white line he'll have forever let him finish. Then he said, "You don't get to talk to me at work anymore. You don't work here. I do." And he picked up his pans and he walked out. I wasn't there. Dell was. And she called me from the parking lot, laughing so hard she had to stop twice. Vance Coastal Catering surrendered the bay on February the 28th, broom clean, as required. Whit never came himself. He sent a crew. He scrambled for a commissary in Brunswick County, 40 minutes away, and got one. And he kept about half of those 63 weddings by driving everything up and down Highway 17 in a refrigerated truck at 4 in the morning. From what people tell me, the food was never the same, which, well, it was never his food. I saw him one more time, middle of March, at the same supply house. He was at the counter, and the kid behind it, 23 years old maybe, was telling him his account had been changed to cash on delivery, and Whit Vance was counting out bills onto a rubber mat with a whole line of people behind him waiting. I did not walk over. I did not say a word. I placed my order under my son's business name, and I left. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that felt like nothing. It felt like something, but it didn't feel the way I expected it to. And I've come to think that's the most honest thing I can tell you about revenge, when it finally arrives. It's quieter than you pictured, and it doesn't fill you up. It just closes a door that had been banging in the wind for 4 years. Bellamy and Okafor Provisions opened in that bay on April the 11th. I went. I stood in the back with the vendors' families, and I did not make a speech, because nobody asked me to, and it wasn't mine to make. Dell cut the ribbon. And then, before the crowd went in, she took my son over to that big walk-in, the same freezer, the same door, and she pointed at the frame. The names were still there, all 31 of them. She'd never wiped a single one. She held out her hand, and Nathan took the grease pencil out of his knife roll where it had been living since November, and he crossed out number 32. Then he handed the pencil back to her, and Dell said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear it, "In this kitchen, we're going to need this for the good list." They keep it on the same door now. Other side. It's names of people who've moved up, with the dates. There are 9 on it as of last month. Sloan filed in May. It was quick, and it wasn't ugly, which I suppose is its own kind of sad no assets to fight over. No children, just 2 people signing at different times. I won't pretend that part sits easy. I didn't do this to end my son's marriage, and there are nights, at my age, in a quiet house, when I turn that over and wonder whether a better man would have found a way to do the one without the other. But I keep landing in the same place. If Sloan had stood up from that table on November the 8th, if she had pushed her chair back and said one word, any word, none of the rest of this would have needed to happen. Not the lease, not the letters, not the loading dock. One person standing up would have ended it. She didn't. 40 people didn't. And I've come to believe that a marriage doesn't end when somebody signs something. It ends the moment one of them decides, in public, that you're the thing they'd rather manage than defend. People ask me if I want an apology from Whit Vance. I don't. I've stopped waiting on people to turn into something they've shown me over and over they have no intention of becoming. That's not bitterness, friends. That's just arithmetic you eventually learn to do. And I'll say the thing I've been chewing on since November, in case it's useful to somebody out there tonight. I used to think men like Whit Vance believed they were better than the rest of us. I don't think that anymore. I think it's worse than that. I don't think we register with them as people at all. I think we're weather to them, something that happens near them and passes. Because I finally figured out why he hit my son in front of 40 witnesses instead of in a hallway. It wasn't temper. Temper happens in private, behind a door, and then people apologize. He did it in the open, at a birthday party, with a class ring on, because in 19 years in that county not one single soul had ever made him pay for anything. He wasn't losing control. He was demonstrating that he had it. And the only reason that ever stops is that somebody, someday, quietly turns out to be standing on the other end of something he needs. What I've got now is a Thursday morning, 5 a.m. Every week, I drive out to my own building, and I help my son and Dell load the truck. I'm 61, and I'm mostly in the way. Nathan makes me coffee in a cup that says the business name on it, which he knows perfectly well I get a little foolish about. And I watch him move around a kitchen that nobody can throw him out of, and I don't see him flinch when a door swings open behind him anymore. 4 years, that flinch was there. I saw it every holiday and I passed the rolls. It's gone now. That's what I got out of all this. Not the loading dock, not the 41 missed calls. That. If this one meant something to you tonight, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't yet. It helps more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing. And I want to hear from you. If you'd been at that table on November the 8th, 40 people, forks in hand, blood on a tablecloth, would you have stood up? Tell me your city, and then tell me the truth. I'll be reading. I'll see you on the next one.